Welcome to Sit Around the Fire, the podcast dedicated to the men and women on the front lines, first responders, military personnel, and their families. I'm your host, Ashley Dillard, and together we'll explore the challenges, the triumphs, and the real stories behind the uniform. In each episode, we'll talk about mental health, wellness, and the unique culture that comes along with serving in a high-stress environment. From building strong relationships to navigating the weight of the job, this is a space where we can be real, share experiences, and support one another. Whether you're on the front lines yourself or you're supporting someone who is, this is a podcast to remind you that you are not alone. So grab a seat, pull up to the fire, and let's get into it. Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Sit Around the Fire. So glad that you're here to join the conversation with us again, and I am incredibly excited to talk about the topic that we're going to dive into today. I think it is so empowering to understand the why behind the protective outputs of our nervous system. And to be honest, when people come to see me and we're having this discussion around the stress and trauma responses of flight, fight, freeze, and fawn, when we relate these back to patterns or thoughts or behaviors that we're experiencing in our life, it is almost like a light bulb goes off in their head. And I can see a physiological change in them when their shoulders drop. They kind of are so much more at ease on literally just understanding the why behind what's going on for them. And so today we're going to dive in a little further into kind of what we preferenced back in episode 1 around flight, freeze, and fawn, and really kind of digging in and understanding how these are protective outputs of our nervous system. First of all, becoming aware of when they're showing up, but then also giving us an opportunity to be able to work with them when they are there. I want to jump back and speak a little bit more into the overview of what we talked about in episode 1, because we have to have an understanding of the brain and the nervous system before we look at these protective outputs. So we need to remember that the brain's primary job is for survival. All it's going to do is make sure that we stay alive and we stay safe in the world that we're operating in. So it is constantly taking in information through our sensory systems. All of these inputs coming in get kind of received, decoded, worked through, made meaning of, and then our nervous system is going to put out an output in response to that. Now, these information sensory pathways are something that have been with us for a very long time. They're usually developed early in life, or some can even argue within utero, and it's an adaptation to whatever environment we also grew up in. So it's important to know that even though we are always operating at the highest level of our nervous system, it is not an end-all be-all. So if you choose to and you want to do things differently, you absolutely can be able to do that. But you have to understand where your nervous system is at right now. And especially when we relate this back into complex stress and trauma, is we're just looking at a series of events that changes the nervous system over time. And what we're left with is an inability to be able to integrate and regulate into our present moment. So when we talk about the protective outputs of the nervous system, all of these protective outputs are actually 100% normal responses to what's happening around you. And Gabor Mate puts out this excellent quote, which I use frequently, but it really brilliantly explains things, is you're experiencing a normal response to abnormal and unnatural circumstances. So it helps, again, like we mentioned before in episode 1, to debunk this idea that there's something wrong with us, and more or less knowing that our nervous system and our brain are adapting to everything that's happening around us. Furthermore, we need to look a little bit deeper into some of the neuroscience and the pathophysiology and the anatomy of what the brain does. And without getting incredibly nerdy on you, which I can easily do, I will try to hold back a little bit. I get excited about talking about this stuff. But we have to look at the amygdala. And the most simple way, I think, to break this down, to look at the amygdala is to understand that it's like a built-in alarm system. And this alarm system comes with this idea that is actually our lizard brain. And the lizard brain, if we can all picture and imagine this, the lizard brain has a panic button. And it's that, oh shit moment, this is not good. We have to make a decision. So when the amygdala is actually activated, we're going to experience an increase in heart rate, and we're going to get a lot more blood flow with more oxygen that's coming to our arms and our legs to literally prepare us for a fight or a flight response. This is really the beautiful intricacy of how the nervous system actually works for us. But when this lizard brain takes over, while the conscious brain, or what we talked about, the prefrontal cortex, is still trying to make sense of things, the prefrontal cortex actually starts to get weaker and go offline. And as we mentioned before in episode 1, when the prefrontal cortex goes offline, that decreases our ability to even cognitively think through things. When someone is giving us some information or speaking to us, if we are in the amygdala side of the brain, we are going to interpret that information with the lens of the lizard in panic mode. We are not actually receiving the correct information that somebody is sending us. It also very much disconnects us from the ability to connect with other people and to emotionally regulate. So in that amygdala side, the panicking lizard side of the brain, we are really only in the flight or fight response. Now, when people have anxiety disorders, this response can be overactive and the body goes into threat mode even when there is no perceived threat. So a very sensitive amygdala can instantly send us into that, what we call amygdala hijacking, where it takes over our brain and we're experiencing this anxiety. And I can definitely relate to this a little bit as I'm still working with my anxiety and my anxiety part. But it is truly fascinating when everything can be what we would say, quote unquote, normal for a day. And suddenly there's some sort of trigger or a perceived threat, and that lizard brain of mine gets activated, and thus the introduction of anxiety, which we'll talk a little bit further into. But I think it is important to understand and to become aware of that it doesn't always mean that we need to have these massive triggers that cause anxiety. It could be the littlest things that we're not even aware of or we're not even paying attention to. So when the amygdala is triggered, we become extremely less rational and way more emotional. And it is kind of a catch-22 where if we were in the prefrontal cortex side of the brain, where we would actually be able to process emotion and regulate emotion, it could be a very healthy thing for us to experience those emotional ebbs and flows. However, when we're in the amygdala hijacking state, the lizard panic mode state, we experience emotions in a very misdirected way. We make decisions and behaviors that often create way more stress for us in the long run. So, what I want to talk about today, and I think the best way to be able to explain this is if we think about this in a little bit of a visualization type exercise or a metaphor. And I want you to picture that you're sitting at home watching the Discovery Channel, and you have a gazelle that's out in the middle of the Serengeti eating grass, and there's very nice classical music, and the British guy is narrating and talking about how the gazelle's living, and everything feels very good. And then all of a sudden, the music starts to amp up, and there's a lion that starts creeping in through the tall grass towards the gazelle. Now, physiologically, what happens to the gazelle is extremely similar to what is going to happen to us as humans. We are going to get flooded with a series of stress hormones from the amygdala and then the hypothalamus, and our adrenal glands all come on board to release adrenaline and cortisol. Now, both adrenaline and cortisol are extremely helpful at certain situations, but when we're in these chronic states of constantly releasing adrenaline and cortisol, it wreaks havoc on our hormones, and it wreaks havoc on these different areas where these hormones are made. So if we circle back to the gazelle and thinking about, okay, it's just been flooded with these acute stress hormones. The gazelle is going to go through a series of responses, which are called the 4Fs, or the stress and trauma responses. And it's going to make a decision on what it's going to do to actually mitigate this threat. And today we're going to talk about the flight side. So if the gazelle chooses to move into the flight state, is going to look like the gazelle outrunning or making 10-step ahead decisions to try to get away from the threat, and hoping either the threat gets tired enough, or it gets bored, or it loses interest to where it'll just go away and no longer be there anymore. Now, flight is not always a bad thing, and in certain situations, it can definitely mobilize energy for us when we need to put it into action. So if we think about how in our jobs, depending on whether you're going to fight a structure fire or go in a high-speed chase or take a 911 dispatch call, except anything like that, the flight side can actually be extremely helpful for us. It can make us more industrious, so it can help us to actually get stuff done. It can help us to disengage in a healthy way and kind of give us that signal of when we do actually need to walk away. So although it can be very helpful, most of the time we have kind of rode that train as far as it will go, and we moved into more of the dysfunctional flight side. So the chronic overall picture of what flight does for us in this high sympathetic side of the nervous system is it's going to lead to things like sleep disturbances, blood sugar issues, sexual dysfunction, compromised immune system, chronic tension and chronic pain, as well as memory issues, cognitive dysfunction, so not being able to necessarily put information, learning new things or putting information together, and also gut issues. And we'll kind of break into this in another episode talking about the gut-brain axis and how truly powerful nutrition is when it comes to the mental health side of things. But I just want you to keep that in the back of your mind, realizing what these huge health impacts of the flight response really actually are. Physiologically, what's going to happen to us in this protective output of the nervous system when the decision is made to flee, to literally get away from the threat, is it's going to produce these, what the body thinks are productive reflexes responses. So we get that huge upregulation of the sympathetic nervous system. So if we think foot on the gas pedal all the way, like the fastest, most quick response that we can do. Physiologically, what this is going to look like for us, so we're going to get an increase in heart rate and blood pressure. Very normal when those stress hormones get dumped into the body. Those are two things that we're going to definitely see that have a purpose. Any of the non-necessary activities within the body are going to be slowed down. So things like digestion, reproduction, any of that kind of stuff, those systems tend to kind of go off a line, while the priority is, okay, we need to have increased heart rate, increased respirations, increased blood pressure so that we can sustain whatever we need to flee or flight away from. You're going to see how your blood flow is redirected into certain places. This can in turn cause sometimes your hands and feet to feel extremely cold and clammy, which is a really interesting thing to kind of just pay attention to. Sometimes your face may flush as the blood and the hormones kind of circulate through your body. Your pupils will dilate so that you can take in more light to actually be able to see better. It is a protective way that the body responds. All of your senses are heightened. So suddenly now you have this expanded state of hearing things or sensing things more deeply, seeing kind of a little bit sharper in ways. You're going to feel much more tense and twitchy as that adrenaline and cortisol is released. The blunt pain response is compromised. So we've all have watched and seen many shows and movies where somebody gets shot or impaled in some way and they don't even notice that they're actually in pain until they come out of this flight high sympathetic response. All blood's going to kind of be diverted away from the organs as well. So again, we're focusing on what do we need to do to stay safe and to stay alive right now. You're going to lose voluntary control of your bladder. Your digestive process is going to slow down. And we talked about kind of increased respirations so that we can get that increase of oxygen intake. And then as those stress hormones are kind of continued to pump through the body, that's going to take an impact on the endocrine system as well too. What we see here in the overactive state of flight, which we kind of mentioned before, is this chronic state, is when we get these hypersensitive amygdalas. And I would very much argue to say that most of us who have served time in public safety or as a career in first response have developed a very sensitive, hypersensitive amygdala that chronically gets triggered over time. The nuance of this is sometimes we get into spots where we don't necessarily even realize that this is a thing that's happening, but it just becomes a very normal response, or we don't understand the why behind what is actually happening. And when it's getting triggered over and over and over, or we're getting these severe responses to no perceivable threat, thus like panic and anxiety, it is going to impact our behaviors in a huge way. You're going to see, and I love explaining this because, again, it's that light bulb moment for people to truly understand the why behind what's happening. So we kind of talked about what happens with the gazelle, but let's focus on us as humans. It's going to look like things like workaholics. It's this constant drive to be busy, doing something, working all of the time. Because for several reasons, if we're not thinking 10 steps ahead, we don't have that predictable pattern on what's going to happen. And as we've talked about before, when the brain doesn't have a predictable pattern of what's going to happen, it feels extremely uncomfortable. In fact, I would argue to say that it's going to do whatever it can possibly do to have a predictable outcome or to have that Rolodex card to be able to go off of. Hey friends, I wanted to let you in on a little something special that's happening through Sage Space Technologies. For this week, offering a Black Friday special for you to take home your very own Sensory X1 lounge. Now, if you've ever seen me in person or have come to experience the Sensory Lounge, you will know that I think people like coming to use that piece of technology over just coming for therapy. It is an incredibly impactful, non-invasive, drug-free, and safe option for clients with physical, cognitive, and emotional health concerns. It is super easy to set up, and you have a ton of selection when it comes to engineered sound programs to achieve specific benefits. It's going to help you overall to accelerate entry into deep meditative states. It improves body and mind communication for greater harmony, promotes balance of the body through support of cellular homeostasis, promotes sustained calmness and self-awareness, supports performance enhancement and recovery from physical activity, and encourages comfortable exploration of non-ordinary states of consciousness. So I think you guys have to check this out. The vibroacoustic therapy is an amazing tool and an amazing technology. So don't waste time now. Use the discount code BF20. That's BF20 at sagespacetechnologies.com to get your hands on your very own X1 lounge, sensory lounge. Don't miss out on this sale. It's an awesome time. Make the investment in you. You're totally worth it. That is in why we think 10 steps ahead. And I laugh about this a lot too, because I'm with all of you when we think about, okay, I need to think about the 10 million situations that could possibly come up with this. If I can say, okay, like this will come if this happens, or this will come if this happens, or I'm planned and prepared for this option to happen. It's constantly in this state of threat, living in a state of threat where if I'm busy enough, if I'm doing enough, if I'm working enough, then I'm never going to be thrown off. Which in reality, that's not really how life works. But it is not safe to rest. And I think this has been a huge lesson for me personally over time to experience, because when I'm often encouraged by my husband to like, hey, why can't you just sit down and rest? Or why can't you just sit down and watch a movie all day or anything? It's like, well, in theory, it sounds awesome. And I would actually really love to do that. But there are moments when my nervous system is not on board with that. And rest actually feels even more threatening than just getting up and doing a lot of things. So I am continuing to work on myself and live my journey out and work on my nervous system so that rest can actually feel restful and good. And I see this a lot with people that I work with, and I've experienced this when I was back online, is you could be so extremely tired getting off of shift, come home and want to take a nap more than anything. And yet my nervous system was so keyed up, and I was still so heavily in the sympathetic side of the nervous system that I could not rest. And so what I ended up doing, which we'll talk about in another episode as we explore more of freeze, is searching for a very high stimulus to be able to dysregulate or disassociate myself more or less, and to be able to check out, because still rest didn't feel safe. We talked a little bit about the need for having all of the 10,000 options figured out, and this is where the overthinker side of the system kicks in. And it goes along with that predictable pattern that the brain is really searching for, is overthinking everything. And if some of you are kind of smiling or thinking about, oh yeah, like this really makes sense and explains who I am, then welcome to the club. And now you have the information that maybe perhaps you've been looking for all along. But this need of overthinking, or taking something and really trying to break it all out, or again, have that predictable outcome. If this happens, if this happens, if this doesn't happen, we have to do this, we need to do that. That is really your protective output of this flight side of the system. It can also look like overtraining. And this is a really unique way that our body and our nervous system respond to the flight side of the system, is we can see this overtraining in a physical sense of where if we think, if I just go to the gym more, if I just lift heavier, if I do this many more reps, if I run this amount of length, whatever it is, fill in the blank with the exercise. The overtraining side and the flight side of the system is really that protective output. And what ends up happening here is our body will actually respond negatively back towards us. And I mentioned this a little bit in episode 1 as well, where we see the negative response, instead of experiencing increase in endurance, increase in muscle growth, and all of those really good things we're looking for, the body actually reverts back and it starts to deteriorate over time. And we start to see an increase in injuries or a longer period to recover, increased soreness levels, or feeling extremely tired all of the time. All those things are a result of that overtraining that's actually happening. And those are protective outputs, again, happening from the nervous system. One of my favorite things about the flight side is this need for perfectionism. And if we look at this with the lens of a threat response, is if we're not thinking these 10 steps ahead and everything is not perfect, it falls very in line with the need for control. And control in our environments and control in our lives is really a way for us to be safe and okay. And this is a very coy snake that comes into the garden, we'll say. Is sometimes we don't even realize that this is what we're doing and it's the why behind why we're actually doing it. We have this very strong desire to make sure things are going to be okay and the people in our lives are going to be okay. And thus we have to have control over what's happening, not only just for us, but again, for those people in our lives. And control falls very heavily along with that desire for a predictable outcome. And if we think about this from a first responder picture, is we're very much trained for tons of different situations that we can apply a predictable protocol to. For example, if we have a cardiac arrest or we have a, whatever it is, we have a protocol that we follow. We have an algorithm that we follow, and we're trained in these ways to be able to respond to these situations and emergencies. Now, because we have to finally realize that we don't live in two different worlds. Our brain does not distinguish between the work side and the home life side. And every category is going to carry over one into the other. So sorry, but you cannot have a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde type response to this. Is the patterns and behaviors and the things that you're doing at work are going to bleed over into your home life and vice versa. So if we come home and we have this strong desire for everything to be in control, everything to be in order, and then we'll finally feel good about our environment, and then we'll finally feel good enough to rest, that is not going to be a very fun outcome for you. You are going to truly not be a pleasant person to be around. And/or you're setting tons of expectations that are ultimately going to lead you to a road of resentment. You're going to resent the people around you, you're going to resent the people at home, and you're going to end up resenting yourself. And so the strong desire to be in control, we have to understand that the why behind this, and understand that this is actually not serving us very well in the long run. It can also, in the flight side, we see anxiety show up. And I really like talking about anxiety, and I get really super frustrated when I see a bunch of memes that say, your anxiety is lying to you. And I just wish more people could understand truly what anxiety is and why it shows up. And understanding that anxiety truly is just a protective output of the nervous system. Anxiety is not the cause of stress or a physiological condition. It is a physiological state. So we're experiencing things in this state that are actually meant to help us. So in the example of anxiety, it's the result of stress, it's not the cause. It is an output. In the brain, the brain and the nervous system are going back to what their primary job is, we mentioned early on, is keeping us safe, keeping us alive, keeping us okay. And the sense of anxiety is the brain, the nervous system's way of trying to be able to do that. So our brains are predictive. So it's beneficial for the brain's survival for it to look for the threat and the danger, especially if we have been exposed to a lot of danger. And you can definitely recognize this show up as well. I've talked to a lot of people, and I used to be this way too, and I'm still working on it, even being out of being online and on the streets for almost a year now. I'm still working on this and still working on rehabbing my nervous system. But there was times when I would be in a restaurant and I would not feel comfortable sitting with my back to the door. That was an absolute no-go. It's not going to happen. Or I would be in a concert venue or in a movie theater, and I would look for all of the exits and how exactly I was going to get there, looking for what could be the potential obstacles that I might encounter. If something were to happen, what can I be prepared to do? And I remember I was actually in Wyoming at a concert in a very cool old venue, and I had a very hard time just like sitting and being present and listening to the music, because all I could think about is, oh crap, like if there's a fire in here, I'm on the second floor. There's literally one way out of here. And of course, being an old theater, there's one way down a fire escape with a couple hundred people who would need to get down. And now those odds were not comfortable to me. And that's when I think I had another very good moment, a light bulb moment, for lack of a better phrase, show up for me, is like, holy cow, like how did I get here? Like, how can I be somewhere where I'm very excited to be? Hey guys, thanks for taking the time to sit down and listen to the podcast. Whether you're actually sitting and watching, or you're driving or multitasking, whatever you do, it's super awesome that we can connect with you around the fire. If you want to get further connected into the community that we talk a lot about here, I invite you to check out the link in the show notes below. It'll give you an opportunity to stay connected and at the forefront of all the communication happening. I'm going to send you something special to start working on your nervous system today, so keep an eye on your inbox. And now, back to the show. Listening to an artist that I absolutely love to listen to, and I can't even be present enough to do that because I'm in this high state of threat prediction. I want you to pay attention to when this shows up for you, because it's going to be different for everybody. Everybody's going to have a different threshold, and it's very sneaky in the way that it can show up, is even in the way that you lock your door at night, or what your routine is before you kind of shut everything down and go to bed, or how do you function in a crowd. All of these things, these are responses because we have been exposed to a lot of danger. Our jobs put us in a lot of danger, and we're trained to constantly be in this threat prediction mode. And while we have to be in this way at work in order to be able to literally survive and stay safe and keep those of us around us safe, is again, this is where this doesn't translate very well into home life, because suddenly now our home feels like a threat, and those who are in our home also feel like threats. And this can look like so many different little things versus, there is a pile of dishes in the sink, or the toys are left out, or someone's not behaving and doing something the way that we want it to. All of those things feel like threats, and our brain cannot distinguish the difference between a pile of toys or someone running at us with a weapon. It feels extremely the same. And so we have to be able to work with our nervous system in those different situations to be able to interpret the messages differently, because that lizard with the panic button doesn't know any different. And that's why it can be incredibly frustrating to people when their spouses or their families at home don't understand why we act the way we do. And this requires education not only on our part, but for our families and our people around us as well, so that we can all work together and we can all operate at the best level of our nervous systems. Once we see kind of anxiety hit its threshold, because anxiety only lasts for so long, then we start to see things like panic set in. And panic really feels like the extreme level of a threat. And sometimes panic can even be the precursor to what we see in depression. So anxiety was the prediction of a threat. Like, we don't know for sure what the outcome is going to be. Physiologically, we might experience things that may keep us from going to do that thing, be it racing heart rate, sweaty palms, upset stomach, headache, anything along those lines. Once that threat becomes so overwhelming, panic sets in, following by depression, because now depression is how the entire world, everything in it, feels like a threat. So we literally need to shut up shop and stay home, because we can't trust anything around us. Everything feels extremely threatening and overwhelming, which ultimately leads us into freeze or functional freeze, which we'll talk about here in a few episodes. But it's important to distinguish anxiety in this way, because we have to reframe it. We have to understand that when the vagus nerve gets dialed down chemically or through various mechanical limitations, anxiety is going to increase. Translated such, if we're living in chronic high sympathetic nervous system states, it is going to be extremely difficult for us to tap into the vagus side or the vagus nerve, which the vagus nerve, to get a little nerdy on you for a second, longest innervating nerve in the body, starts at the base of the skull, runs all the way down to the sacrum. It innervates with tons of different organs and pathways responsible for like rest, digestion, recovery, restoration, all of those things. When we're in that chronic sympathetic state all of the time, it becomes extremely hard to actually tap into the vagus nerve. Thus, you're going to feel more anxiety all the time. And actually, we find that respiration with muscles supplied by the accessory nerve, which exits the base of the skull with the vagus nerve, become more active and reinforce that sympathetic state. So now, instead of being able to easily tap into the parasympathetic side, that resting recovery state of the system, it's actually easier for us to go into sympathetic again. HRV becomes less coherent when the vagus nerve is pinched at the base of the skull. And I do the sleep tracking thing and look at my HRV a lot, and it is very crazy to see over time how you can have such a low HRV and then be like, oh, well, that's because I'm like really not actually resting. I'm really not in that parasympathetic state, because I might still have a lot of the residual stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol flowing through my body. So I like to have that conversation around anxiety, because it can be extremely impactful to understand it and to not feel like you're always at war with this anxiety part, but really come at it and understand it is trying to serve you a purpose. It is trying to protect you in the way that it knows what to do. We just have to figure out how to do some rewiring and some reworking within the nervous system to be able to work with that anxiety part so that we're not constantly fighting it all the time. What will happen in these different states of flight, fight, freeze, and fawn is that we never just default into one method. We're constantly ebbing and flowing through these all of the time. And in the high states of the sympathetic side, fight and flight, those outputs can only last for so long. And then suddenly we find ourselves in other states like freeze, functional freeze, or fawning, which is kind of a mixture of the two systems together. But I think it's important to recognize and realize you're not just going to be on a constant flight response. You're going to see these behaviors and patterns show up in a lot of different ways. Now, I want you to pay attention to when these show up for you. This is the most powerful thing to understand, is when you are having this sense of being a workaholic or feeling like you need to constantly be doing something or working, signing up for overtime or another special team or things like that, I want you to really be aware of what you're doing and why you're doing it, and pausing for a second to ask that question of why. Why do I find myself here right now? Why do I find myself in this protective output? And it can be any of these extreme behaviors that we see. So not just overworking, overtraining, or feeling like you have to be a perfectionist, but also looking for some of these kind of hidden behaviors, extreme behaviors that I call them, that show up as these protective outputs. For example, this can look like eating disorders, binge eating, anorexia, purging, just kind of going to food as your soothing coping mechanism. Food is a huge one. It can also look like using a substance. So whether that's alcohol or some other drug, anything that you go to for that sense, or excessive spending, even gambling, or dangerous relationships. All of those things fall into this flight side response because we're looking for ways that we can control the situation. Coming again back to that need for control, that need to stay safe, that need to kind of feel something comes out of this flight side of the system. So pay attention to if these behaviors are showing up somewhere within your life. And again, it's not always the big ones of, substance use or things like that, but pay attention to what your food patterns are looking like, or pay attention to what your spending patterns are looking like. If you find yourself excessively shopping and spending money for some reason, or if you find yourself standing at the fridge a lot of times, those little ones can show up in a lot of ways that we don't necessarily pay attention to. Like we mentioned before in episode 1, the first step to all of this is just being aware of it. We have to understand what's happening, getting to know the why, and then putting action towards changing these things. So I am super excited and looking forward to having some more conversation about this and the 3 other responses that we'll talk about: the fight, freeze, and fawn, and dysfunctional freeze within the freeze side. And I invite you to come back and check those conversations out. You've got to understand these other 3 outputs. And I wanted to kind of give each one of them their own time and their own episode to really dive in. But I invite you, if you have questions, to get interactive. And you can leave them in the comments below, or you can shoot over an email. But if you have questions about this, or you're wondering okay, you're talking about this nervous system work and these protective outputs, what does this mean? Or what is this behavior showing up that I see? But if you have questions, bring those to the conversation. And that way we can kind of address them and answer them as they come up as well. And thank you so much for sitting around the fire again with me today. I'm excited to talk next time about the fight side that we experience in the sympathetic nervous system. And I will look forward to seeing you around the fire very soon. Stay safe, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sit Around the Fire. We're excited to keep the conversation and connection going. I invite you to check out our website, link in the description below. Also, don't wait to get signed up for the upcoming workshop, Strengthening Bonds, working on efficient communication between first responders and their partners. You can sign up for this via the website or the link in the description in the notes. We look forward to sitting around the fire again with you very soon.